Hi, good afternoon or morning or evening. I'm Hannah Zeven, the founding editor of Parapraxis Magazine and the co-director with Alex Colston of the Psychosocial Foundation. And I'll just say, because it's our second meeting and there's some new faces in the Zoom, we're hosted by these two new groups, both Parapraxis, a popular magazine of psychoanalysis on the left, and more crucially, right now, the Psychosocial Foundation, which is entering its second year. I just want to encourage you briefly to sign up for our mailing list, which you can do on the foundation's website. We have lots of programming coming up this year that might be of interest to those who are participating in the seminar. And also, of course, you can subscribe to Parapraxis. We're currently working on issue 2, which has the same theme as the seminar and has several of you writing for it. And we're very excited about it. If you liked learning about Melanie Klein 2 weeks ago with Fakhri Davids and are interested in learning more, we're about to run a short course on her work in March that has a few seats left. Or also in April, we're having a 5-week seminar on Winnicott and beyond after the war, taught by Dr. Peter Goldberg. So I will just drop a link to the short courses page. There's registration information for both of them, as well as scholarship seats available. And then lastly, also in March, which is suddenly like now, we'll be having our next event, a roundtable on love featuring Anahid Nersessian and Ranjani Chatterjee. That's coming up as well. Okay, so without any further ado, with the kind of announcements out of the way, it's my total honor and pleasure to welcome my colleague and my friend Grace Lavery to talk to us today about Sedgwick and Munoz. So Dr. Lavery will pop up on your screen in a second, but she's the author of Quaint Exquisite, Victorian Aesthetics and the Idea of Japan. I'll drop all these links in a second because these books are absolutely wonderful. That book was published by Princeton University Press in 2019 and won many prizes and was heralded in the field. And then the follow-up, Please Miss, which was a Seal Press book in 2022, an anti-memoir, which is also incredible. And forthcoming, Pleasure and Efficacy of Pen Names, Cover Versions, and Other Trans Techniques will be out this year from Princeton University Press and is also phenomenal. Lastly, still forthcoming, written, I've read them. Closure, Heterosexuality in the American Sitcom, Duke 2024, and Parapraxis was very lucky to publish a small preview. So maybe some of you have seen that. So Grace is now currently shopping 2 novels, one of them an autofictional educational memoir, the other a speculative history of the Cornish independence movement. She is currently conducting research towards what will hopefully become another set of short books, one on the animal portraits of the 18th century painter and anatomist George Stubbs, and the other on Jimmy Savile and the culture of child sexual abuse at the BBC. So Grace, now to be done with a formal introduction, is clearly one of the most capacious and various and vital thinkers. And so we're very lucky to have her come speak to us about these two similarly vital and capacious thinkers, Sedgwick and Munoz. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Grace Lavery, and I will now drop links to her many books.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that extraordinary introduction and for all of your kindness over the last few years reading my work, which I've sent at you more or less constantly. One of the downsides of being as kind of, logorrheic as I seem to have been is that I place an inordinate pressure on my friends to keep reading my work. So I'm very grateful to those who have done so. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Sedgwick and the Munoz essays today. And I guess I want to say in advance, just because otherwise, it might just sort of come across as like a buzzkill. One of the things that I'm doing here, I think, is trying to work through my own institutional and, in some ways, generational and Oedipal antagonisms around not necessarily these thinkers so much, but the world that they inhabited, in the world that they created, in the world that these two essays, I think, created, which is a world that we live in, but also a world that doesn't exist anymore. So it's a sort of strange, there's a strange orientation towards time and periodicity here, that at certain points will come across, I suspect, as a bit of a buzzkill. But I assure you, we're all friends. Once the curtain goes down, we all hang out and have coffee or whatever. So the title of the presentation is On Veneration. On veneration. Sedgwick's essay in 1997 and Muñoz's in 2006 make a distinction between affective conditions described as normative and those described as depressive. What that distinction between normative and depressive means turns out to hinge on complex relationships that they describe between normativity and universality, a third term that comes up in different moments. Sedgwick takes the word normative from Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, what Butler commends as, quote, the normative focus for gay and lesbian practice. Important to say in that moment of Butler that normative means good. This is something that Butler thinks should happen, cited in Sedgwick 139. While Muñoz formulates his idea of the normative in the lived experience of, quote, people of color and other minoritarian subjects who don't feel quite right within the protocols of normative affect and comportment. So normative affect and comportment being the source of that experience, or that concept of normativity. There's a sort of strange universality on both sides of Muñoz's formulation, since in Disidentifications, a few years prior, he had argued that the quality of being or feeling minoritarian, a term that he explores at length in that book, is experienced by everyone in some context at some moments. When then he positions as the subject of his essay, not the Latina of the title, but, quote, people of color and other minoritarian subjects, it's not exactly a universalism, but he's imagining a motley group of different kinds of minorities, so capacious that its limits cannot be predicted in advance. Sedgwick's understanding of universality derives from her belief that it is the paranoiac and not the, quote, liberal subject that is positioned as the archetype of all critical and intellectual labor. That's an idea that she pulls from Peter Sloterdijk's satirical portrait of, quote, the universally widespread way in which enlightened people see to it that they are not taken for suckers, Sedgwick 141. In both these cases, then, the normative finds itself in a strange relation to the universal, as if by a kind of stereoscopic view of the two essays, a picture emerges of a universal norm that in reality directs the behavior or self-conception of nobody at all, and a set of particularizing ethical and aesthetic norms that must be treated not merely as though they were counter-hegemonic, but actually not norms at all. Sedgwick and Muñoz might be said to exhibit an embarrassment about their own normativities that's wholly absent from the material they're citing, the Butler and the Sloterdijk. In the section of Gender Trouble that Sedgwick cites, Butler has used the word normative to describe a commitment in the light of the mass production of death, queer death by capital. Queers should strive to comport themselves in a particular way, which Butler calls demystification. Sedgwick disagrees about what it is that queers should do, but rather than dispute on those grounds, she attempts to wrest from Kleinian psychoanalysis a critique of normativity as such. Yet nobody who has read Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading has failed to notice the obvious fact that Sedgwick commends and does not merely describe Klein's depressive position as a position for scholarly engagement. She merely does so by insisting that the depressive position is not a norm, which, as Sedgwick acknowledges, it certainly was for Klein, but as something else. Though she doesn't use the word, what I think she's referring to is what psychoanalysts might call a decathexis. It's hardly the fault of these critics that they fail to denote a firm distinction between norm and decathexis. That problem is fundamental to, and in fact constitutive of, psychoanalysis as a discursive body. Freud never reached a definitive conclusion about whether psychoanalysis should be normative, i.e. therapeutic, or merely descriptive, i.e. epistemological. I've written about that split in Freud a lot, and I'm not going to rehash those arguments here, especially since life being what it is, I'm no longer convinced I was right. But what I hope to exfoliate here is a pronounced ambivalence in Muñoz and a more muted, but still more convulsive ambivalence in Sedgwick concerning the queer academic's relationship to psychoanalysis as a body of knowledge. The paradox of Sedgwick's paranoid reading of paranoid reading has been endlessly debated in the 27 years since the essay was published. And indeed, like the southern states who do not hide, but flaunt their commitment to racialized violence, it is a paradox with which Sedgwick is disarmingly comfortable. Take, for instance, the sentence, and this is on 140, a further problem with these critical practices, colon, what does a hermeneutics of suspicion have to say to social formations in which visibility itself constitutes much of the violence? The argument is clear and compelling and persuasive. It compels by demystifying the supposedly irresistible power of demystification. Muñoz's essay is direct about how it is mobilizing psychoanalytic theory, feeling brown, feeling down. It's positioned not merely as a normative political goal for those racialized as Latina, but as the position of therapy, and even to use a term to which Munoz in a more uncomplicatedly normative mode will turn later, utopian. In this essay, quote, the depressive position is the ethical position, 683, but it is also utopian. Reparation is a part of the depressive position. It signals a certain kind of hope, 687. Hope is in some ways the central term of cruising utopia, which is the kind of the grand theory of queerness that Munoz published a few years later, which adapts parts of Ernst Bloch's The Principle of Hope. In other words, both Sedgwick and Munoz appear convinced that Klein's positions are neither normative nor developmental, but more to the point, the gesture of these two essays is odd and almost the exact opposite of the claims usually ascribed to them. Both seek to retrieve and reclaim precisely the normative elements of psychoanalysis, its drive towards a possible mode of living that might exist after the analyst has held and perhaps dispensed with the cathexes that trap libido in neurotic configurations. The difference, and it is an unexpected one, is that they have taken the goal once known as therapy, healing, or treatment and replaced it with a term that is not self-evidently a synonym for any of those, depression. In the time that remains then, let me offer a few speculations, paranoid no doubt, but like all paranoid heuristics aim towards some possible or at least virtual restoration, about why the term depression might have served these two authors as a model for healthy mental life. Munoz is clear that the turn to Klein is merely opportunistic, a sort of historical or theoretical alibi that legitimates articulations of affect as a racially formative and deformative phenomenon. Quote, while the work of Melanie Klein and her circle is not tailored to attend to the vicissitudes of racialization and ethnic particularity, I nonetheless find some of her formulations suggestive and helpful when trying to discuss what I'm calling brown feelings, 676. I've been thinking quite a lot about the terms that this particular clutch of queer theory essays, this period of queer theory writing, the adjectives that it uses to denote good, and suggestive is often one. But the other one, which is more interesting and in a way more perverse, given that this is coming out of queer theory, is the word generative. And both Sedgwick actually and Munoz use the word generative in these essays to describe something that is good, that is worth preserving. One might wonder whether generativity is a good in itself. Certainly, queer theory was wondering that at the time in other contexts. Sedgwick's Klein is less shy than Munoz's when it comes to normativity. Sedgwick calls the depressive position an achievement, glossing Klein, but Sedgwick insists on the putatively transformative element of reparation, i.e. Sedgwick emphasizes the notion, which he knows is not really in the Klein, that the object that is made whole in the depressive position is not the real object, nor is it identical with the object that preceded the splitting method of the paranoid schizoid position. Since the central example of this repositioning in Klein, which I now learned that you've all read recently, concerns the weaning of a child from the breastfeeding that had caused it to see its mother as irreducibly double and split, one might wonder what it would mean to attribute to Klein's 8-month-old, who is coming out of the paranoid schizoid phase, what it would mean to attribute to that figure the capacity to reconstitute the two breasts as something other than the body of the mother. In any case, it is difficult to imagine such a transformation that does not incidentally vacate the distinctive position that Klein accords to the mother. And it's interesting, I think, that in neither of these essays is the question of paternity or maternity raised, even though it really is a sort of fundamental dimension of the Klein. And I have, hunches about why that might be, but I think broadly speaking, it's because Sedgwick in particular is so keen to emphasize that she wants to understand positions as non-developmental and non-teleological and non-normative, not in fact even motivated. This is sort of, she uses the word oscillating to refer to them, as though one is just like constantly swapping places. So the gesture of attributing to some canonical theoretical text a suppleness or ambiguity that in reality both author and reader know is at least half fantasized is not an intrinsically undignified critical maneuver. Derrida referred to this procedure as paleonymic. That is, an archaeology of naming, which he sometimes glosses as rereading. For Derrida, as for his early Anglophone readers, paleonymy was itself a psychoanalytic practice, grounded in the need to reread historical text in the light of one's own experience, and particularly, although this is a little more abstract than it might than other parts of the argument are, the purpose of rereading is to take into account the ubiquity of allegory as it had been theorized by Paul de Man. Now, we don't have time to go into the Paul de Man, but this is nonetheless a sort of psychoanalytic framework, because Paul de Man essentially says that there is no procedure that can arrest the consideration of any phenomenon, any cognitive or mental phenomenon is allegorical. And in fact, therefore, because the allegorical is never fully determined, in fact, allegory is ubiquitous. And if that's the case, then the meaning of everything, the meaning of words, the meaning of texts changes quite dramatically over time. And one needs to constantly return to them in order to uncover these allegorical elements. But not just Paul de Man. In a less oblique way, Derrida's concept of paleonymy drew on original psychoanalytic research conducted by Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok in their book, The Shell and the Kernel, which I wonder if people still read that book. It's a really, really wonderful book if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's basically a long list of, it's in several volumes. I think they're all available in English, published by Chicago, but each one of the chapters is about a kind of very familiar psychoanalytic term: mourning, object, phobia, penis envy. That embarks from the premise. So it's an essay on these terms that embarks from the premise, determined through sustained readings of Freud, that these terms were in fact less stably defined by Freud than he and his readers assumed. So if you are familiar with the book that is much more widely read, which is the Le Planche and Pontalis Language of Psychoanalysis, itself, a wonderful book, you would come away from that book thinking that penis envy has a very obvious and denotative meaning. And what Abraham and Torok are saying is that actually, Freud rarely uses these words in the same way twice. And for that reason, the ways in which we appropriate these concepts needs to kind of take into account this instability. So that, I think, is something that Derrida cites when he's theorizing paleonymy, and in general becomes part of the sort of post-structuralist method of reading literature, from which Sedgwick is emerging at this moment. So the relational complexity of these analytical rereadings frames gestures that in Sedgwick and Munoz appear quite different from each other. But Munoz, whose explicit concern is to draw Klein into an account of comparative racialization that he thinks her work is not inherently capable of addressing, rereading is a self-conscious act of appropriation, of setting to work. It is therefore also necessarily an evaluative procedure, which he characterizes as bolstering. My central goal has been one of enacting and performing a sort of reparative analysis that describes and bolsters the project of feeling brown. I have been puzzling over that word bolster and what exactly it might mean in this context for the last few days, and haven't got any better than just writing out the sentence, what is the future of a bolstered depression? So maybe you can help me with that. Meanwhile, there is no better word for Sedgwick's treatment of Klein than paranoid, in the sense that her argument can never shut down to its own satisfaction the question of whether the position can be truly comprehended outside of a normative frame. The rhetoric of such a paranoia takes up many forms over the course of an essay bristling with symptoms, perhaps most distinctively on page 150, an anacaluphonic intervention that is both a retranscription and a refusal to retranscribe the Kleinian text, in the reference to, quote, Klein's insistence that it is not people but mutable positions, M dash, or I would want to say practices, M dash, that can be divided between the paranoid and the reparative. So it's kind of beautifully rhetorically complicated moment, because it seems as though Sedgwick is both speaking as Klein, but also speaking to correct Klein. And that's a kind of complicated situation between the two. Anna Kaluthon, incidentally, is a sort of rhetorical figure that Deman makes much use of in his writing on allegory, but again, that's not really within the remit of this paper. Crucially, however, Sedgwick's paranoia in respect of Klein belongs in a domain quite distinct from the paranoia she ascribes to D.A. Miller and Judith Butler, which after all is paranoia concerning the machinations of the state and its institutional operatives, including its text and its canons of value. Sedgwick's paranoia, on the other hand, concerns solely the relationship that might exist, but equally might not exist, between the reader of psychoanalytic theory and the body of work that calls itself psychoanalysis. Nestled within a melodramatic account of two theories of reading, then, is a far more specific account of an actual problem faced by readers, or at least by the reader who now writes, Eve Sedgwick, the question of what can be salvaged from a body of work that appears both necessary to one's liberation and utterly inimical to it. Which question draws Sedgwick indirectly back to Munoz, whose question, after all, is how any experience of belonging might be independent or might be made independent of what he calls crypto-universalism, the possibility that belonging itself might organize bodies through racialization and through other means back towards coercively constructed theories of the universal subject. I'm suggesting that the depression exhibited in these two texts and bolstered in at least one of them might be better understood as attempts to grapple with the problematic inheritances of psychoanalysis and perhaps more broadly of theory than as theories in themselves. Both essays are, not quite accidentally, characterized by deeply wounded attachments whose presence rarely recedes. Sedgwick's notorious feud with D.A. Miller, the details of which remain unwritten but ubiquitously whispered at conferences, presents as a desire not to allow the text of a paranoid book, like the novel and the police, become a synecdoche for the author or for the author's body. Sedgwick is insistent on this point several times, but declines to note that Miller's book is relentlessly committed to erasing that very distinction. As in the end of the chapter on David Copperfield, Miller treats his own recurring physical pain as a neurotic symptom partly caused by and somehow partly effectuating the convergence of his own hidden name, David A. Miller, and the pseudo-autobiographical subject of Dickens' novel, David Copperfield. Given which critical tact comes to look more like a necessary displacement prior to retranscription. For Munoz, whose autobiographical subject is less present, but still occasionally hovers underneath the text's many references. For example, in his description of the central characters of Tomás Gutiérrez Alea's film as, quote, a proper revolutionary subject and a gay bohemian, which is more or less the phrase with which Munoz describes his relation to his father in Cruising Utopia. But the addressee is nonetheless clearly his former academic advisor, Eve Sedgwick herself. Munoz refuses Sedgwick's strong distinction between text and author when he writes that Sedgwick invites her readers and the field of queer critique to consider reparation, page 683. And do have a look, if you have a chance to right now, at that paragraph, because I think I'm about to say the only interesting thing in this paper, and it concerns the syntax of that paragraph. Perhaps symptomatically, perhaps not, Munoz's formulations of his own argument emerge from an unambiguously nominalized I. In the paragraph just cited, the subjects of the 5 sentences are Sedgwick, Sedgwick, I, and finally, the stitching I am doing. What do we owe to those who mutilate us with knowledge? I recently declined a dinner invitation from a former mentor, not because he ever hurt me, but because I can no longer imagine putting myself in the position of absorbing him, and nor can I imagine any other mode of engagement that would not feel, to me and possibly to him, a kind of Oedipalization, and therefore a kind of infantilization. I once left a conference before giving my talk because I saw the name of another mentor in the conference brochure vomited, and was unable to do anything other than vomit until I had left the city altogether. That person had hurt me. On another level, I've just spent the better part of a decade working on a book about Freud, designed in so many ways to recover a kind of Freud that I'd not seen anywhere else. Freud the pragmatist, Freud the therapist. The experience of composing and publishing that work has left me almost allergic to my own knowledge of Freud. I wish I knew less. I wish that this knowledge, which after all is knowledge from a man whose company in real life I would take pains to avoid, could leave me by any means other than publishing. Perhaps by vomiting. These are clearly not depressive positions, none of them. They are all paranoid schizoid, and I'm quite happy with the belief, or at least the hope, that depression is prior to the schizoid mode of analysis, rather than necessarily coming afterwards. Depression is, I suspect, the normative affect of capital par excellence. That is, at least, is an argument that feminists have made consistently and persuasively, from Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, through the Scum Manifesto, through Elizabeth Wurzel's Prozac Nation, to the febrile and relentless feminisms of Sarah Ahmed, Jasbir Puar, Hortense Spillers, and many others. When the 68 Hours declared "Soyez réaliste, demandez l'impossible," they refused the sobering reassurances of reparation, not on the grounds that they aren't fun, but on the grounds that they don't, in fact, depict the world governed by capital with enough precision to persuade paranoia to pipe down. It is too much to say that depression is a position of privilege. For Munoz and Sedgwick, as is clear, depression is hard won. But it does prompt a question that is at least worth asking, even if we know the answer already. What if we owe psychoanalysis literally nothing? The cohort of scholars around and succeeding Sedgwick cultivated an almost ubiquitous moralism concerning the value of what in my grad school days were known as the 3 yeses. The notion that before one utters a critical word about an assigned text, one needs to apprentice oneself to it, to allow the text to respond to your criticism through you. The work of acquiring expertise in theory was, from the start, the work of neutralizing the instinctive urge that arises in relation to every pedagogical imposition since the beginning of time, that urge to say, fuck this and fuck you. Because we have all dampened that urge to the degree of being able to see nuance and elegance rather than confusion and pretension, we find ourselves placed by Sedgwick's hand in a necessarily paranoid relation to our own bodies of knowledge, which are positioned as both that which we must change and that to which we must conform. So what if we began with neither paranoia nor repair, but with the position through which they are sublated into a singularity, the negation of the negation, the schizoid itself? That's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. It's like stunning to be pulled out of it. This building, you're like, I'm done. The mic. I invite now anyone who has questions for Grace, either about what she just presented or elements in the text that we want to think about with Grace. I see Thomas already has a hand. So just again, I invite you to use the chat or raise your hand like this. Thomas, please go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say, wow, that was like so brilliant. There's so much to think about. It's totally wild. And it ended so suddenly too. So it really drew attention.
Yeah, I was aware I was going on too long. That's why.
Yeah, kind of for the sake of humor, I just want to say like, fuck this and fuck you. But actually, I have a question. You said something about nestled within Sedgwick's text is a more complicated question about what can be salvaged from theory that's like vital and inimical. And there were these 2 parts, one part from the Sedgwick text and one part from the Munoz text that I sort of highlighted. There's this part on page, what page is this? 678 of Munoz, where they talk about how sorry, I'm just finding it. This move to identify the radical impulse in developmental theories aims to recast the theories outside the parameters of positivism and enact their political performativity for circuits of belonging that do not conform to a crypto-universalism. And then within Sedgwick, there's this part on page 126, I guess, where they talk about how what's illuminated by an understanding of paranoia is not how homosexuality works, but how homophobia and heterosexism work. And I remember reading these and thinking like, wow, like it seems like what they both want to do for the sake of still, I guess, understanding psychoanalysis is to be like, yes, like the homosexual position is like very paranoid, but we just need to ask, why is it paranoid? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And it kind of reminds me of the like quote about how like psychoanalysis is like a diagnosis of a sexist society and not like a reproduction of one or whatever. So I guess what I'm wondering, sorry that was such a long question, is do you think that's what they're trying to do? Like, do you think that they want to like salvage psychoanalysis by just like accepting the supposition, but then like saying that the supposition is actually like a socially contingent phenomenon? Or do you think that's like reading too much into the text?
I definitely don't think it's reading too much into the text. I think it's certainly a part of it. What I was trying to emphasize is that because they are both invested in this method of partial reclamation, they establish a kind of paranoid relation to the thing that they are partially reclaiming, which has to be at once that which needs to be salvaged and that from which we need to be salvaged. And to me, that's a problem for which the answer would have to be pragmatic rather than, strictly theoretical. And I think there's a pragmatism in both these essays. But, to respond to two other elements of that really wonderful and rich question, the distinction between learning about homophobia and learning about homosexuality that is important to Sedgwick, I guess what I want to say is, like, I don't think that is a distinction. I don't think that is something that necessarily matters. If one is thinking about this, again, according to sort of, a pragmatics, then something like homosexuality exists only insofar as it comes into contact with and is created by institutions of knowledge production. Homosexuality does not necessarily exist in the gay club, except insofar as the gay club is an institution. Homosexuality exists in matters of policy, and it exists in matters of, legality. And so, because of that, my claim would be that there is no necessary distinction between the category of homophobia and the category of homosexual. And again, this is, I think, a fairly conventional queer theory position that, like, the Eve Sedgwick of the Eve Sedgwick of a number of different essays would actually, I think, agree with, which is that there are sense-making procedures for understanding patterns in our own desires and our own practices. But the moment at which those sort of concretize into an identity, they do so necessarily within an institutional framework, because that's what the word identity means. We don't have an identity independent of procedures of legibility and procedures of identification. So I'm not sure that paranoia needs to be evacuated or dispensed with on the basis that it is more concerned with the kind of negative framing of homosexuality than the positive framing, because, as they say, to me, these conceptualizations are part of the same institutional framework. And then I think the second thing, just to kind of like underline something that maybe came a little bit too quickly towards the end, but it's that I don't think that this is an avoidable problem that they run into. If we are dealing with texts that are both somehow emancipatory and somehow tyrannical, and psychoanalysis is that for me and for both of these authors, and maybe for many other people in this Zoom chat, then we have a paranoid relation to it. I think that the word paranoia doesn't mean or doesn't have to mean anything distinct from that, than that sort of feeling of ambivalence about wanting to destroy the thing which we also want to preserve.
Thank you so much.
Wendy, and then we can go to the chat briefly and then keep going up top.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace. I really appreciate that. A question came up in reading that may be a bit removed from what you spoke about today, but also your talk helped kind of clarify the way in which I want to ask it, which is thinking about Schreber as the kind of original example of paranoia, but also as someone who described what might in the present be a kind of forced feminization fantasy in some way, a displacement of desire to some sort of third party who might be enforcing it, or maybe it's too presumptuous to read it as ever having been a desire, given that it gives him a lot of distress. But I'm just curious about thinking of paranoia in, I think, both the Sedgwickian sense of this kind of ambivalent relationship or to the inheritance of psychoanalysis, but also in the Butlerian and Hockingham sense of it being an index of some sort of systemic oppression, that it seems in a way like paranoia might also be a kind of repressive position where desire becomes reconstrued as something outside of oneself, as in the case of Schreber. And I guess I'm just curious about how, because I don't know that much. I mean, I've read Schreber, but not so much the Freud on Schreber to see how paranoia is originally articulated and how that feature of it is described clinically. But I guess I'm just kind of curious how you see this particular moment of queer theory, if at all, dealing with that inheritance of paranoia coming from this original instance of a kind of I don't know,
we can say it. We can say the word. Eh?
Yeah, just this what to me does kind of rhyme with more contemporary descriptions of a kind of forced feminization fantasy. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about that, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, I want to begin by licensing the kind of anachronism, because I spend a lot of time and I've spent a lot of effort trying to kind of defend the sort of provisionality of any and all trans designations, and the notion that what is real is transition rather than transness. But what is remarkable to me about the Schreber case is the degree to which it feels utterly contemporary. The thing that is maybe not to my credit or to anybody else's credit, but the thing that really rings true for me is that the forced feminization, or the kind of desire for a sublimated feminization, or however one wants to frame it, is so tied with this kind of like absolute megalomania. I must become a woman and save the universe. And that kind of sense that there is some connection between resexing oneself and intergalactic salvation is something that it's very strange, but one sees that everywhere in like transsexual literature, and one sees it everywhere in transsexual community, frankly. So, when I think about Freud's original determinations of paranoia, there's a lot that does come back to Schreber, but I think that there's also a lot that comes back to Freud's work with 19th century psychologists that he was attempting to dispute, and particularly the diagnosis of dementia praecox, which Sedgwick talks about a little bit. And so to me, I think of it less as a kind of struggle to co-opt and absorb this kind of wonderfully florid psychosis, if that's what it is, and more an attempt to kind of I think it's a fuck this and fuck you to Krepelin and to the other physicians of his generation who want to come up with these incredibly restrictive definitions, medicalized definitions of paranoia, but also I think to try to place paranoia, or dementia praecox anyway, in conversation with other milder, more neurotic conditions. So which is interesting because, you know, Freud is, of course, well and rightly known for having expanded the category of treatable neurosis from something very small and usually involving torture to a much wider category of neurotic conditions that are more or less universal. But I think that Freud's relation to psychosis was much more complicated. And actually, there's a moment where you begin to sense the narcissism of small differences between him and someone like Kraepelin, because Kraepelin's move is to try to bring dementia praecox into the field of the treatable. And Freud's move is to say it's not within the domain of the treatable. Actually, you know, in order to understand this, we have to look at this totally florid fantasy by a judge who wrote a book nearly 100 years ago about how he was going to be forced to be a woman and save the universe. And, you know, so again, one of the things that, I mean, like, I love and I hate Freud, like everyone, right? But one of the things that one always has to bear in mind about Freud is he's a deeply, deeply petty writer. And he will invest a very great deal in trying to make a professional rival look bad. And I think that's part of what's happening with the Schreber case. And, you know, in the meantime, what we get to see is the sort of glorious symptomaticity of that very gesture and the ways in which Schreber surprises Freud and leaves a mark on Freud. And eventually, you know, this is a claim that I've made elsewhere. I think that transsexuality eventually becomes the sort of archetype of any and all neurotic conditions for Freud by the end of his career. But you know, what this does make me think about is the path not taken for queer theory was Deleuze. And that was maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing. But, you know, for the Deleuzians, for Deleuze and Guattari, and then for the Deleuzians, Schreber was the kind of the central figure of psychoanalysis that needed to be rescued and retrieved. The sort of the figure of the body without organs was Schreber, the figure of the schizoanalyst was Schreber. You know, 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, it seemed to me that there was a kind of Deleuzianism in the US that was political and militant, but definitely heterosexual. And that was around people, you know, who were like, well, Zizek would be an example of that. He sort of had his Deleuzian moment with the body without organs, which I think is 2006. But also, you know, what's that guy's name who wrote the Fear the Spectrum Said essay, which is good, by the way, but, you know, and then there's that, you know, there's a Deleuzian sociological text from around that time called Psychedelic White by Arun Saldana, which is really brilliant and has like these kinds of, yeah, exactly, Jackie, exactly, Steve Shaviro, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Psychedelic White by Arun Saldana, which is about the clubbing scene in Goa, is a really interesting book, but it's, you know, again, like it's kind of more butch than you would expect given the topic. And people would always say, I'm into affect theory, by which I mean the Sedgwick kind, not the Deleuze kind. That was something that you would hear people say very often in order to identify themselves. And it seems to me that actually the negation of the schizoids is more fundamental to early 21st century second wave queer theory than we really recognize. I'm not a Deleuzian, I'm not interested in resuscitating Deleuze, but I am interested in the negation of Deleuze as a founding gesture or refounding gesture for the field. And Schreber, I think, is, you know, one of the figures there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So just I'll gather a couple comments from the chat quickly. So one is, I think, quite sort of direct, which is that you mentioned this leaning on of suggestive and generative in both these texts, on these texts and queer theory of this moment to mean good. Like this is a good theory to think with. Can you expand more on what you're seeing there? That's question one. And the other, it comes from Benjamin Meyer, who says, and I'll just read it in quotes. So I want to say Freud does desire this as well. I think this is when you're sort of saying the love it, the first time you're gesturing at your love and hate at the end, the entire deconstruction and reconstruction of psychoanalysis in another time. I think your talk helps highlight why. And the question beyond it for me, this is Ben, is about repression and whether it might be avoidable with it, we appear to be slaves to knowledge and revisiting power relations in time. So how to transcend, end quote. So these two very different questions.
Yeah, beautiful questions. The second one, I'm not totally sure I can answer directly, except to say, you know, let's think about that together, what it might mean to imagine a psychoanalysis without repression. But yeah, no, so generative is a word that is used in Sedgwick to refer to something that can be done with Klein, which is other than agreeing with Klein's account of the depressive position. And helpful and suggestive is the phrase that one gets in the Munoz. But again, I just sort of think these are indicative of a broader discursive universe where we couldn't really say things were right and wrong because there was something kind of cat-handed about that, or it didn't matter if things were wrong and it didn't really matter if things were right either. But we couldn't say things were good or bad either. So we needed to find language to suggest value, to impart value or import value without seeming to do so in too clumsy a way. And so what I find interesting about generative and to some extent about suggestive is that the value that is imputed in those adjectives is the value of continuing the conversation. So if something generative is good, it's good because it allows you to keep going. And keeping on going is what we are trying to do. We're trying to prolong or extend a line of thinking as far as we can. And that prolongation of a line of thinking is sort of the, is the point. Enabling and disabling just came up in the chat. And I think there's something there too about making other syntheses possible. But of course, I mean, you know, the point being that, and I think this is what Jackie's getting at in the chat, but I'm not really able to respond to it in real time. You know, generative is also an investment in a highly heteronormative understanding of value and a highly heteronormative understanding of extension. You know, and I think we don't have to, and maybe we shouldn't normalize or universalize extension as a good in itself. That there can be value in shutting something down. There can be value in interrupting something. There can be value in, you know, finding the answer to something. And these are all ways of attributing value that aren't exactly the same as good and bad or right and wrong. But that notion of prolongation, I think, is a questionable and in some ways objectionable one. So the second question had to do with repression. You know, like whenever one teaches psychoanalysis, like one of the first things you always have to say is like, this repression is good. Repression is how repression is how people are made. Repression is how history happens. Repression is how most people deal with suffering, and it mostly works. Sometimes it doesn't work, and then you need to figure out different responses to it. But, you know, I also think that, I take the question to be a kind of dissatisfaction with that framework, and I share that dissatisfaction. I think that there is something. Leo Bassani has this great line in Receptive Bodies, which is, you know, his last book and a really, really underrated book, where he says, you know, psychoanalysis has actually nothing to do with the psyche. It's really got nothing to do with the mind. It's all about the body. It should be called soma analysis. And the point being that it is about liberating the body from the mind. It is about finding bodily sources of pleasure that have been interrupted in the course of becoming a person. That seems to me to be a beautifully erudite and thoughtful encapsulation of the essay on infantile sexuality, the central lesson of which is that we don't create a sexual profile by addition, but by negation and subtraction, which is still a kind of interesting thing. And still challenges a lot of people, I think. But I like that idea. Psychoanalysis is, I think maybe psychoanalysis could be figured as something that would allow us greater freedom, but that would of course be against Freud's own interest, or it's a thing that he flirts with, and it's a thing that he recoils from. We know that. I mean, the endless psychologization of Freud is like, both part of the problem and also a necessary component of the solution. So I'm very much in the same mode, as you can see, that I've described in Sedgwick and Muñoz myself.
Fantastic. Grace, are you up for taking these last two questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Nika and then Lily. Or just Lily?
No, sorry, I had a question. I was just lowering my hand to start talking.
Oh,
Because the little hand thing kind of distracts me. I'm like, susceptible to pop-ups. But if that's okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
of course.
So, about like the kind of sentimental critique of Sedgwick's work, because I think that it kind of applies to the institutional position of psychoanalysis. She is a white female whose work focuses on, homosexuality, and so she,
male homosexuality specifically.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not a native speaker of English, so when I grew up, like the categories were gay and lesbian, and so for me, is gay and like lesbian is something else. So anyway, but so she is straight and she is white. She is straight and she is white, and so she has no like quote unquote lived experience in kind of the area that she is studying through literature, as well as through these secondary psychoanalytic sources. And I think that what I'm interested in with the use of psychoanalysis in like outside of psychoanalytic institutes and outside of psychology departments is that it is like imported into these spaces that actually really privilege lived experience. So the lived experience of people of color, the lived experience of like people of all sorts of alternative sexual practices, and as well as I think, but what's not present, I come from an English department. What's not present is a sort of privileging of the lived experience of like a lived patient experience. And Sedgwick herself was not diagnosed. She started seeing a therapist when she was diagnosed with cancer. So she didn't have a psychoanalytic or psychological diagnosis while she was writing, as far as I know. So I guess it's that problem that I have with psychoanalysis, like given its like historic roots in the institutions of Vienna and in particular that have been shown to be like anti-Semitic, sexist, repressive, bourgeois, racist, homophobic, like obviously, like why salvage it in the contemporary academy for the humanities?
Cool. Yeah, big question. I have a few thoughts on the stuff at the start of the question, and I will attempt an answer. It's the sort of really wonderfully direct question that came at the end. So, embarrassingly, my training is a Victorian. I'm a Victorianist, scholar of 19th century British literature, and I have retained enough affection for a figure like Matthew Arnold to believe, in the most naive and probably indefensible ways, that part of the value of literature and of culture and of thought is that it allows us to meaningfully experience phenomena that are not part of our lived experience. I feel like that has to be the case, even if it shouldn't be, because nobody literally just writes about their own experience. I mean, I've written a memoir, so I've sort of come as close as one can get to the experience of writing out one's own lived experience. And I just found the experience of doing that almost more alienating than anything. I mean, it was much more alienating than anything I've written otherwise. It's, a series of self-estrangement. So, I have, I would want to defend Sedgwick's right, if we want to put it in those terms, to talk about things that she hasn't personally experienced. On the other hand, and this is where I think things become a lot more complicated, what is very clear is that Sedgwick's attachment to gay men and to the culture of gay men was routed through a sense of simultaneous belonging and unbelonging, for which she primarily sought to punish trans people. And as we see in her writing in White Glasses or whatever, there is a thwarted trans masculinity everywhere in Sedgwick's writing. And then you think, well, it's kind of interesting that 3 of the founding figures of queer theory had this thwarted relationship to trans masculinity. Sedgwick, who came the closest to writing about it directly in White Glasses. Judith Butler, who now uses they, them pronouns and is sort of insisting that they never understood themselves as not trans, but they also, Judith has this thing about not wanting to feel like they're treading on anyone's toes. So like, I don't want to talk about this too directly because I don't want people to think I'm just like jumping on a bandwagon. But yeah, I basically like have always thought of myself as like trans non-binary. And then Lauren Ballant, who never really talked about these things directly, but used they, them pronouns and gave a couple of interviews where there were just sort of like suggestions of identification with transness. So it's kind of interesting to me that this body of work that did so much to treat gay male, white gay male cultures as typical and typifying of a universalizable queerness actually come from this very curious position on the other side of a partially articulated trans masculinity. Now, Jules Gill-Peterson has criticized Sedgwick's essay, How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay, as sort of transphobic. I think I've gone a lot further than Jules has. I think that it is I think it's a version of, it's an essay of which is more or less indistinguishable from a sort of mainstream TERF position in 2022. It feels as horrified about transition affirming care for children as does Ron DeSantis. But there's this attachment too, and if there weren't the attachment, then it would be a different kind of story. So that's that's just part of the story, and I think we're still grappling with that. But every time that I have said anything about Eve Sedgwick in public, I always get these squads of people telling me how I've misunderstood Eve. She was great. She was kind to everyone. Everyone loved Eve. There was no one who had a bad word to say about Eve. I was trans, and I always found that Eve was very supportive, except for the only trans woman that I've identified who was a grad student of Eve Sedgwick's, who did not say that, and in fact said that she experienced Eve Sedgwick being profoundly hostile towards her when she decided to transition. So it seems to me that, and also that person is like one of very few Sedgwick's advisees who wasn't white. Munoz, of course, was one of Sedgwick's advisees who wasn't white, but there were not many. And anyway, that's just part of the story too, is that I think if you were at Duke with Eve Sedgwick and José Muñoz in the late 90s, Munoz is a grad student, you feel like you've got it nailed. You really understand what queerness is now. Everyone can be a bit bisexual. If you tell someone you're straight, then that's kind of gauche. If you tell someone you're gay, that's kind of gauche. If you are willing to say that, sexuality is a spectrum, then you've tick the right box. And if you say that you're trans, that's worse than gauche. That was the world that was created, and it's a world that had a number of winners, and it also had a number of losers. So the other question was, why try to salvage psychoanalysis at all? And there are two I think, necessary responses to that. One of which is like, if you can get away with not doing it, you probably should. People, I don't think, choose to try to salvage psychoanalysis because they feel like it's a good idea. It's a brainworm, and once it's in you, the only way out is through. And the thing is, it's a brainworm that's not just in me, but it's in the world. So there is something about it that is just annoyingly irresistible. And it's annoyingly irresistible because it's fundamentally, a question about what can be done between two people using the media of time, language, and money. And that's an interesting question. And I think it's something that produces desire. So again, I would never say if someone felt like they didn't want to read psychoanalysis, my response would probably be something like, good for you. I'm also a recovering alcoholic. It's a little bit like that. And whenever like someone tells me that, they want to get sober, they're worried they're drinking too much, I'm always like, no, just please fucking keep going. Like, you just live as long as you can like this. And then, only try sobriety when you literally have no other options. Otherwise it won't work at all. But also you'll have missed out on some of the experiences that are necessary. So yeah, I would never try to persuade someone to be interested in psychoanalysis. And incidentally, nor did Freud. There's a great story about when the poet H.D. started analysis with Freud. Freud required one thing of her because she was sort of a celebrity, and that thing was that she not defend him. He required of H.D. that she not defend Freud in public, and I admire that. There's a lot that I don't admire about Freud, but I admire that. And I think there's something important about that. So yeah, don't defend Freud, and if you can get away with not reading him, probably don't, but you probably can't, sadly.
Yes, the brainworm that exists in you exists in me. So we'll take Lily's question and then we'll move into the next phase. Thank you so much, Grace.
Hi. My question is kind of similar. I'm seeing in the chat to a comment that Pamda made, but it's about queer theory and this kind of like what you were describing as an Oedipal relationship, or this where we're at with it contemporarily. And reading these two essays, hearing so much in especially the Munoz, like the grammar structures of the sentences and the way you're talking about the vocabulary. I was very curious about the paragraph where you were kind of deconstructing the I's and the Sedgwicks, and I wanted to ask you to touch on that briefly. But also, yes, just like maybe on a bit of a grammatical level, what is sort of resonating with you about this kind of work? And I think that when you said prolongation is questionable, that like solved so many things for me in my head about what to do with queer theory at this time. So I love that, and thank you for that. And but yeah, just maybe a bit of like a generational take on queer theory, or where you're at with the way that it's kind of using words and sentences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the first thing to say in response to that is that the prolongation question, my thinking on those topics will always probably come down to Freud's last clinical paper, Analysis Terminable and Interminable, which is, I think, if I, when I'm forced to name my favorite Freud, it's that one. And the reason is that it comes up with a totally unexpected answer to a problem that is ubiquitous in psychoanalysis. He solves the problem in this most bizarre way. And the problem is, how do we know that psychoanalysis works at all? Well, because we see some patients who are relieved of symptoms through psychoanalysis. So then why are some patients not relieved of symptoms at all, even though they can be in psychoanalysis for a long time? And what about the people who are relieved of symptoms but then the symptoms return? And is there an amount of time? Is there is there a period over which you can be fairly sure that psychoanalysis would work? And his answer to that is that the limiting factor here is that human beings don't live long enough to work through the trauma that they accrue in infancy. And to me, that is a very beautiful and true. I think it's true. I think it's a true sentiment that that what actually causes the problem is what Freud calls the quantitative factor. It's a numbers game. You know, there is too much. It's not that it is. Yeah, exactly. And then you can imagine like the sort of like the immortal analysand. And of course, you know, lives do get longer. There is that too. Anyway, where am I in terms of my Oedipal relation to queer theory? I think that for a long time, queer theory had absorbed an understanding of transness, more or less from Sedgwick, that was wrong, was just like sociologically wrong. But I think it was also pretty damaging to a lot of people who were trying to undergo transitions during that time. I think that, and I've written about this is in my memoir as well, actually, there's a sense in which the kind of wager that Sedgwick wants to make with the world is like, okay, sex is immutable, but everything else you can change. And to me, that is just it means that the foundation of queerness, as it's being theorized, is the negation of transness. Or the negation of transition. I believe pretty strongly that changing sex is no big deal, that people do it all the time, that, you know, sex doesn't mean anything other than the thing that you can change. And I don't think that for kind of complex Butlerian reasons that have to do with sovereign performatives. I just think that because the body uses hormones to sex itself, and you can change how it does so if you take hormones. And that's what sex is. Sex is, you know, the product of various kinds of hormonal practices. And once one is accepted that that's the kind of basic logic of sexuation, then other things become obvious too. But I do think that queer theory was predicated on that kind of negation, or on that kind of fixity. It was, to that extent, a castle built, you know, on air. And I am not comfortable with what I see as the kind of strong identitarian response to that among some kind of trans writers, people, you know, back in the day, people like Jay Prosser, and you know, a lot of the work that I'm talking about now comes from Emma Heaney, who I admire very greatly, but also like Emma Heaney and Greta Lafleur. They seem to have this idea that there's a sort of self-evidence to trans people in the past, and we start with that self-evidence. And that actually it's wrong to theorize with other people's experience. I don't think that's true at all either. I think there is no transness other than transition, is my position. So the Oedipalization is like, I want to maintain some kind of commitment to indeterminacy and a critique of identity, but to do so without, you know, resting that in the kind of transphobic place that Sedgwick does. And I want to find it in the lived experience of transsexuals, who are, as a matter of fact, very often far more complicated about questions of identity than we are required to pretend to be for the purposes of gaining access to social care. So in fact, you know, from a kind of trans historical point of view, and Dean Spade's written about this really convincingly, like, the reason why people say I was born in the wrong body is because the state told us to say that in order to get access to hormones. When I went to the Lion Martin Clinic in San Francisco to begin a course of hormonal transition, I was handed a questionnaire of which the first question was, how old were you when you realized you had been born in the wrong body? And to me, that is a question that does not make any sense. And it's demeaning to be forced to answer it. And I thought that would be, at the time, I thought that would be a thing that would differentiate me from other trans people, and make, I would say that to other trans people, and they'd say, oh, well, that's kind of weird. That's very much what I thought. But it's not. Actually, it's not. When you say that felt wrong to people, very often they will just say, like, yeah, like it didn't feel right to me either, but you just have to tick the box because otherwise I don't give you the drugs. And as a result of that kind of imperative, a whole system of knowledge has been created and is the basis for a trans-liberalism, actually, that has nothing in common with the experiences of trans people. And I'm not talking about like lived experiences, I just mean like desires, you know, like what actually motivates people to transition. But yeah, one doesn't need a reason to transition. You could just take the fucking hormones if you want to. And you can tell whatever lies you need to get hold of them if you want to. I mean, it's like, you know, you don't need a theory of wine drinkers because someone drinks wine.
Grace, thank you so much. I think we should both let you rest from this brilliant presentation, and you gave us so much of your time. Thank you, just seeing the clock. We'll now move into small groups. So just to get in the habit of the frame, what we'll do is we'll take a 5-minute break. If you want to stay around for small groups, you know, stay on the Zoom, even if your camera's off. And if you're done for the day, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Please, though, do use the RSVP to let us know if you're coming, especially if you want to come for small groups, as it helps us get an accurate head count. But if everyone will join me again in thanking Grace. Yeah, that was brilliant and so helpful multiply. Thank you, Grace.
I would love to stick around for the aftermath of the small groups, but
Sure.
I will get off the camera for a bit and
Do you want me
come
to
back in.
text you?
Yeah, would you do that?
Yeah, of course. I'll
Thank
do
you.
that. Exactly. I think good. For folks who are in breakout groups, if you want to sort of suggest or generate what came up in them, the 2 words I'll never be able to write again, thanks to this session. We now are generating a list, Grace, with you. Please feel free to again chat or raise hand function, and we can also come back to where we were, which was quite generative there at the end and suggestive. Go ahead, Alex.
And Grace, thank you for your presentation earlier. Just a question that was coming up in our group that I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on is an experience of taking some of the things we were talking about in your presentation and the readings to the current practice of psychoanalysis and its engagement with these questions of reparation and paranoia in the room or in the kind of practitioner space, and just curious where you stand on any of this.
I am really honored by that question. Thank you so much. I'm not a clinician. I tried to be a clinician once. It didn't work so well for various reasons. But I think I might try to be a clinician again at some point. But at present, I'm not. But it's something I think about a lot. One of the things that has really been guiding my work over the last 10, 20 years is the difference between psychoanalysis as it's talked about in the humanities and psychoanalysis as it's talked about among clinicians. And, you know, I've really been moved by the work that Hannah and the Psychosocial Foundation have been doing to try to foster those conversations. So, you know, I think that there are a couple of things. One is that understandings of sexuation, which I realize is not the tenor of your question, but just to say this, understandings of sexuation within psychoanalysis are, I think, often a little clunky and need to be challenged. It's one of those strange areas where well, whatever, but there are people in the sort of in the practice of psychoanalysis. You see psychoanalysis as an alternative to transition. That is more or less the position of Jean-Pierre Morel, who is the sort of author of Ambiguïté Sexuelle and is sort of from what I can gather, the major French analyst when it comes to trans issues, but she really understands psychoanalysis as a way to experience transition without bodily mutilation. That kind of thing is troubling to me for probably obvious reasons. In terms of reparation, I think that one of the things I would try to center in my own practice were I a practitioner of psychoanalysis would be questions of restitution as sort of slightly distinct. I think that the language of repair, at least as it's mobilized by language of repair is often, I think, in the sort of queer context, mobilized to describe a kind of neutralization, whereby there's no kind of material actions or consequences of the act of repair. I think that's kind of what I object to in the tendency of the Sedgwick piece to elide the specificity of the mother and the specificity of the maternal relation, because I think in both of those essays, what's happening is the question of like how to deal with the mother that is Freud, or the mother that is Eve Sedgwick, or the mother that is theory. And so trying to restore some definitive qualities to those things is I think useful. This can't be anything but a very vague answer, because it's difficult to know how else to talk about clinical experience when one hasn't any. But I think that's my instinct, and I will continue to think about it. And if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear those too.
Yeah.
Great. Rebecca, you can also go ahead.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the talk and the questions that you've answered today. My question has to do with the Sedgwick piece and an undercurrent that I got throughout reading it, that there's a question of what it means to do a reading in general, or what it means to make an argument in general, starting with the opening anecdote about, does it make any difference if we know that the conspiracy we imagine is true? At one point, she talks about the novel and the police saying, no one reads it to find out whether its argument is true. And so there's this question of like, what does knowledge do? And why are we performing readings? And my sense, by the end of the piece was, I didn't get the sense that that was actually strongly answered by Sedgwick. I wasn't sure if she figured that out. So I was wondering if you do find an answer to that in her piece, and regardless of your answer to that first question, I'm also interested in how you would answer the question yourself. I mean, from reading Sedgwick and kind of having these two possibilities that she puts forward of two ways to do readings. You have a paranoid way and a reparative way. Just that, from your point of view, does that provide any resources for you to think about? How do you think about reading based on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting pair of questions, and I hadn't quite noticed, but I think you're absolutely right about the first one. There is a why question for Sedgwick that doesn't have an answer, because repair is the answer to a slightly different question, which is how do we handle the potentially traumatizing or anxiogenic consequences of the reading that we're already doing? But you're right that the question is raised at the start. Why bother in the first place? And I, in a way, I feel stuck answering that for Sedgwick, because one of the things that I think is happening in this essay, and again, I'm reading it as a psychoanalytically inflected critic, so do with that what you will. But can I assume that people in the room have read the novel and the police? Is that a thing that people still read, or should I not assume that? I won't assume that. Okay, so that book by D.A. Miller, his second book, is notable for a number of reasons. It's a sort of major early Foucauldian critique of the novel, the Victorian novel, very important in my field of Victorian studies. But more importantly, and more consequentially, I think, even than that, it introduced into American criticism a literary style, a literary essayistic style that feels French, and Miller knows that it feels French because one of the books he wrote next was bringing out Roland Barthes, and it's very clear that Miller is trying to write like Barthes, or is trying to imagine what it might mean to write like Barthes. So there is in Miller's prose there, and in everything that he wrote afterwards, an extraordinary, and Sedgwick does not underestimate it, it's extraordinarily powerful and compelling charisma, narrative charisma of the critic. It's difficult to read that book without falling in love with David Miller. You know, certainly that's not something that I've been able to achieve, and Miller's works are among the most important works on my shelf. So I you know, I think that's part of the background, is like, how do we feel about remaining kind of in love with this person with whom one has had a very public falling out? And that, I think, is for Sedgwick, and probably for Miller as well, but certainly for Sedgwick, a gendered relation to charisma, such that the kind of narrative charisma that Miller makes such use of in the novel and the police is very different to, and in some ways much more flashy than, the kind of charisma that Sedgwick imparts to her readers. And I think that there's a degree of felt antagonism between these different questions of what can a woman critic achieve, how can a woman critic establish the kind of intimacies that Miller establishes with his readers. You know, one of the things one could say about this is that Miller accuses Sedgwick of appropriating gay male culture, which is whatever. I mean, you know, I think I've made clear that that's not a sort of objection that I have to Sedgwick, but one could equally make the claim that that Miller's understanding of gay male culture pulls on and draws from and appropriates a similar logic of 19th and early 20th century feminist writing and women's writing. And there's always in Miller's understanding of like textual charisma, this question of the mother, the feminine, the drag, the boy, the fairy boy who was kind of a girl, and these kinds of figures are, I think one could say, I don't think Sedgwick did, but I think one could say that there is a sort of parallel kind of appropriation there. You know, so the question that you ask of Sedgwick, why read? I think that the answer has something to do with making a scene for oneself in an environment where one has felt humiliated, neglected, and negated. And I think that is the source of her defiance, the source of her rage sometimes, the source of her extraordinary power, explanatory power, and textual sensitivity, which is, you know, people rightly say among the most exquisite and skilled practitioners of the craft, you know, in the last century. And I think that's true. For me, the question that you then direct at me, why do I write? Or rather, why do I read? I don't know. I mean, why do I read? My first response is a little bit like the one I gave earlier. It's like, if I could get away with not doing it, I would. If I could imagine a world in which I could just like be on my own and like be happy, I would rather do that. But we have all, in the process of becoming adult human beings, absorbed a lot already, and that requires processing. And that's the work of reading. You know, like I suppose in some ways I write about contemporary things. But one of the things I realized recently is that almost everything I write about was in some way or other important to me when I was a child. And maybe it wasn't even written or made yet, but it was figured in some way by something. And I can, you know, that's not as vague as it sounds in practice. It's kind of demonstrably true. So, you know, I wish that it weren't the case that my work of criticism was simply a kind of excavation of my own prejudices, traumas, attractions, cathexes, whatever it is. But honestly, I suspect that's what it is, you know? I'm saying this to someone the other day, I was saying this to Lily the other day, like, I find it strange as a Victorianist when I go to a Victorian Studies conference and there's a bunch of American people who read 19th century British literature for a living. Because I'm always just like, I have to do this. You know, this is where I come from. This is like, but why are you here? You know, you could do anything with your life. So like, what attracted you to this particular scene? And I happen to like Victorian literature. Like, I'm obviously I like it enough that I'm relatively keen to dedicate my life towards it. But at the same time, it's like, I like it partly because I was educated in elite educational institutions in the UK that I better understand when I go through these texts and try to make sense of them.
Well, like with all sessions, we have to stop for today. But Grace, thank you so much for coming by and speaking with all of us and everyone for participating this Sunday. And to our facilitators, in 2 weeks, we'll be back with Michelle Stevens, who'll be presenting both her own work and Beverly Stout's work on Black Rage. Both those articles are in the Dropbox. And if you'll look for a week from today for our RSVP link, it would greatly help us just to have a sense, especially if you're staying for breakout groups. Thank you so much, Grace, as always.
Thank you. If people do have questions, feel free to email me, grace.lavery.pangolin@gmail.com. But thank you so much for this conversation, Hannah, and for the invitation. This has been a really wonderful way to spend a couple of hours on a Sunday.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
It was so good, Grace. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.